Hey folks, I'm going to experiment a little bit. Instead of typing up answers to the final, I'm going to actually show you on the board what happened. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do 3 steps. This is question 1A. 3 steps to eliminating exchange rate risk from foreign investment. So first, you have to buy the foreign currency, and we'll use the euro in this example. Then you have to buy the euro-denominated bond, and the supposition is that you are investing in the foreign economy because the yield on those foreign bonds are larger than the domestic yield. And then you are exposed to the exchange rate risk of the dollar, the home currency, that you converted in the first place. So you buy the euro using the dollar. You want to bring the euro, the principal and interest home, convert the euro back to the dollar and sort of complete the circle. But when you do that, or when you buy the bond, you are now exposed to the risk. So you engage in a forward contract to buy dollars using 1 plus R foreign times the euro you used in the first place. So when you do that, what you've done is you now have an asset in the euro, and you now have a liability in the euro market, and you've now eliminated the exchange rate risk. That is the essence of currency hedging. Okay, that's question 1A. Now, question 1B says, explain the direction the spot exchange rate would change if the difference between the foreign and domestic interest rates rise and investors do not use forward contracts to cover for exchange rate risk using IRP, or interest rate parity theory. This question was meant to be very straightforward, right from the exam. Right from class. But let's remind ourselves. EF minus ES over ES, the percentage ratio difference between the forward and spot exchange rates, is equivalent to the difference between the nominal forward rate and the nominal domestic rate. So the question asks, what happens when this difference rises to the spot exchange rate? So mathematically, the spot exchange rate should go down, so ES falls, which would then take this entire left-hand side of the equivalency up, right? Because we said that there's nothing happening with the forward rate, or one could have said instead that it was T plus 1, the spot rate, or the expected spot rate. Regardless, it doesn't matter, because the supposition is that that's not changing. It's immaterial to the evolution of the left-hand side of this equivalency, and in a sense, and the evolution of the spot rate. But let's think about a little bit more deeply why the spot rate should fall. Well, if this difference is getting larger, which yield is rising relative to the other? The foreign yield. So from the American perspective, if the foreign yield is rising, that means American investors are going to be attracted to buying that foreign bond, and thus are going to be supplying dollars to the market to buy the foreign currency to then buy that higher yielding foreign bond. Spot exchange rate falls. You could also think about this as the capital account balance falling, and thus the balance of payments falling, holding everything else constant, which then definitionally means the spot exchange rate for the dollar is falling. But the real key there is saying, as American investors chase that higher yield, they're supplying dollars to the foreign exchange market. Okay, so that's question 1. Now, question 2, explain one difference between primary and secondary markets. Pretty straightforward. Primary, first transaction, just like primary says, a good example to use is an IPO. The secondary is everything else. Pretty straightforward. That's basically all you needed to tell me. Okay, so once you have got that primary market asset out there, every transaction after that is categorically a secondary market transaction, regardless of how many times it's bought and sold. That was 2A. Now 2B is explain one connection between the short-run assumptions of the macroeconomy and the liquidity effect from the expansionary monetary policy. So we know our three assumptions are: we're not at full employment, we have prices that are relatively sticky, and thus there's some frictions in the market that don't allow prices to move easily. And we also have what we call asymmetric information, in the sense that when we make forecasts for the future, there's errors that are greater than zero on average. We also can call this adaptive expectations. But in terms of the liquidity effect, if we don't use the global macro model, and we could, we're going to get to the same place. But let's say, for example, we're using the sort of just the IS and LM frameworks. And in fact, I can just show you this on the money market alone with money supply and money demand. It's the same basic idea. The idea is, as the LM curve moves like this, which is a reflection of the money supply increasing, interest rates go from their original equilibrium position all the way down here, past equilibrium. This is the new equilibrium. And that secondary effect is called the liquidity effect, meaning that it takes a much larger change in the rate of interest to trigger investors, or to trigger consumers, or to trigger businesses to take advantage of the lower interest rates, because they don't have enough information to know until that rate goes further than it needs to in equilibrium. And as soon as they start to see that lower rate, they start to demand liquidity, and that liquidity effect picks us up toward the equilibrium. So what assumption of the short run connects to the liquidity effect? Asymmetric information. Prices, some of y'all made the case that prices being sticky would help, and to a certain extent that's true, because it allows you to kind of walk in the realm of the real interest rate without any issues in terms of the inflation expectations changing and undermining the movement of the real interest rate. But asymmetric information is what I told you in class is the number one reason why we think the liquidity effect exists. If we had equal information, we would move smoothly from one equilibrium to another, but because we have unequal information in financial markets, that's why we would have the liquidity effect. That's 2B. Now, 3A is state and explain briefly the four definitions of the interest rate we talked about in class. All right. Well, this one is like in the third day of class, the revenue from lending, the cost of borrowing, the op cost of holding cash in a non-interest bearing form, and the op cost of consumption today. You could also think about it as, well, that's the best way of thinking about it. So, you could also think about it as a so-called measure of time preference. So one of the biggest things in macroeconomics, if you go on in macroeconomics, is the idea that the interest rate is this connection between today and tomorrow, which is kind of related to present value. But that fourth one is really suggesting that when you are a consumer, you have a choice to consume or save. If interest rates go up, you have an incentive to save more than consume, because it reflects a rising opportunity cost of consumption today. So those are your four definitions. That was 3A. 3B is it briefly explain the role of government debt in pricing equities, stocks, thinking about how investors consider interest rates on government debt in the pricing formula. Now there's somewhere, so there was a spelling error. I had is instead of in, but the point is this. Government debt, when considered risk-free, the price of equities, remember we had in class, was considered to be the present value sum of the expected cash flows over time based on the expected nominal interest rate discounted back to today. So you think of time t equals 1 till t, where t is equal to time equity or sold. So you may remember we had this breakdown of IE is equal to the real interest rate plus the expected inflation rate plus risk premia. So inside of here, we had the risk-free rate. We talked about IRF, This is related to the capital asset pricing model, but the idea is that the role of government debt is to say what rate of interest is on government debt helps me figure out what this part of this equation should be, and as government debt rises in yield, it increases the discount factor, increases the denominator of my stock pricing formula, assuming expected cash flows have not changed, which you could have easily explained in the answer, and forces prices down. This is why we don't like interest rates rising when we're equity investors. If the interest rate on government debt were to fall, the opposite would take place. So that's the idea. What I wanted to see was you explain the nature of the interest rates within the stock pricing formula and how government debt gets involved in terms of that pricing. Now, I could have worded that a little bit better, and some of the points you got back on the exam, that was part of it, was 3B. All right, well, 4A and B were really the big ones in terms of the last portion of class. And some of y'all look like you did a lot of work on that and left some other stuff behind. But be that as it may, the first question was basically the case where we had domestic government spending or rising or domestic taxes falling with flexible exchange rates and responsive cap flows. So that means that the graph should have looked like this, right? So EE relatively flat vis-a-vis the LM. There's our original global equilibrium with respect to the domestic macroeconomy. The IS curve shifts to the right as a reflection of government spending or taxes rising or taxes falling, like we talked about in class. The domestic equilibrium is here, which means the EE curve, because it is flexible, wants to go up. So relatively flat, responsive capital flows. Domestic equilibrium after the domestic shock of government spending rising or taxes falling, to the left of EE, which means the exchange rate wants to rise and push this line up toward that equilibrium. And as it does that, the increase in the exchange rate is going to then force the IS curve back. IS3. Why? Because imports are rising as our exchange rate goes up and gives Americans a larger advantage in terms of purchasing foreign goods. Right? Our dollar's now worth more, their currency's worth less. So as the E curve creeps up, it reflects a rising spot rate, and we end up at an interest rate and income levels that are somewhat muted from what they could have been because the exchange rate is flexible. This is one of the reasons we talk about in class why some countries don't like flexible exchange rates. And interest rates haven't gone up that much. So the answer is RDOM up a little, YDOM up a little, and exchange rates up a little. Now, in the in-between, the best answer was to provide all the symbology we did in class, and you are more than welcome to look at your notes. This is the exact case number 1 that we did in class. This is just a quick review of the way that the graph that you should have drawn should have looked. Sorry about that. And then ultimately, the conclusions you should be drawing from the graph. Now, you should have shown me all the symbology and all the logic, and a few of you did, which was super. But the bottom line is the following, so let me do a big summary. When you have fiscal policy, one of the biggest lessons in macro is that you have an ambiguity in what's going to happen with the balance of payments. The relatively responsive capital flows suggest that the movement of the capital count, KA, is going to dominate the movement in the current account, CA, in terms of its effects on the exchange rate. Well, because capital flows are relatively responsive by our assumption, as to the way this economy works, we had more capital flows than trade flows as a result of the shock of the IS curve moving to the right or having a fiscal policy increase, and as a result of that, the exchange rate wanted to go up. Okay, that's 4A. Now to wrap up, 4B is a similar question in terms of being expansionary, and I apologize, this was actually case 3, not case 1. What I'm about to do is case 1. So case 3 was our first fiscal policy case. The question 4B on the exam was case 1 of our 8 cases, and it was a monetary expansion with flexible exchange rates in, relatively responsive cap flows. Okay, now you may remember from class that the responsiveness or lack thereof is immaterial to the directional movements of the economy with respect to a monetary shock, because a monetary shock is going to have a unidirectional or a no ambiguity in terms of its effects on the balance of payments and then ultimately on exchange rates. So here we go. Let's redraw equilibrium briefly. Again, we have relatively responsive exchange rates. So we draw the EE curve, and this is somewhat dramatically different, but the idea is that the EE curve slope is flatter than the LM. There's our original equilibrium with a global economic viewpoint, and then the LM curve moves to the right this time, and domestic equilibrium is here, which means with a flexible exchange rate, you're going to want to move down, or this is reflective of the exchange rate falling. And as the EE curve moves to the right, it triggers more exports. So then the IS curve wants to move out, and the idea is that they meet each other along the new LM. What happened? Well, in this case, the interest rate went down a little bit, incomes went up a lot. Right? Because the interest rate went down initially because of the monetary shock, then gets picked up a little bit as there's more dollars demanded, and thus in a sense increasing money demand as a result of selling more exports. And so the foreign sector is now demanding more dollars from the global economy, picking interest rates up a little bit until we get to this new equilibrium. So this is the domestic equilibrium, and this is the final equilibrium where all three cross again. And the idea is that domestic incomes have gone up for two reasons. Domestic interest rates have gone down and then back up, but in net fall. So you have RDOM down a little, YDOM up a lot for those two reasons. Monetary expansion, which means investment domestically picked up because of the lower domestic interest rate, and then exports increase because the exchange rate is falling, and ES is on the move down. So just like I said before, there's no ambiguity. The money supply goes up, total supply of dollars globally increases, capital account and current account both want to move down initially, forcing balance of payments down and exchange rate down, which then wants to reverse the balance of payments imbalance and creates more exports. And folks, that's the exam. Thank you.